The rain came down like it had a grudge, not the soft mountain rain that washed the pine needles clean and filled the creek beds with clear, cold water. This was October rain, the kind that fell sideways off the high peaks and turned dirt roads into rivers and made a man grateful for thick log walls and a fire that knew its business. It came in waves, each one harder than the last, and between the waves there was a sound like the mountain itself was breathing slow and indifferent, the way mountains breathe when they have been standing long enough to stop being impressed by weather. Mace Briggs sat in the chair closest to the hearth, the one with the cracked leather armrest he kept meaning to replace and never did, and listened to the storm work itself into a fury against the cedar logs of his cabin. The kerosene lamp on the table threw amber light across the room, catching the brass of the Winchester rifle mounted above the fireplace, and the small wooden cross on the wall beside it, both carved by hands that had been dead for 30 years, his grandfather's hands. The old man had built this cabin himself in 1961, hauling timber up the logging road with a borrowed mule and the kind of stubbornness that mountains either crush or respect. He had poured the foundation by hand, mixed the mortar himself, chinked every gap between the logs, with the patience of a man who understood that a thing worth building was worth building correctly. He had not been a sentimental man, Mace's grandfather, but he had understood permanence in a way that most people in that era understood it as something you made with your hands and left behind a proof that you had been here and that being here had meant something. I had taught Mace to shoot with that Winchester when Mace was 12 years old, standing behind him in the frost-stiff grass of early morning. One enormous hand steadying the boy's shoulder, saying nothing until the shot was taken, and then saying only what needed to be said. A man who can't defend what's his isn't much of a man at all. Mace was 47 years old and had defended a great many things in his life, some of them worth defending and some of them not. And the distinction between the two categories had taken him longer to understand than it should have. He reached for the glass of whiskey on the side table and found it empty, which was fine because it was the third glass, and three was usually where he stopped on a night when he still needed to think clearly. The notification on his phone had come 2 hours ago from the chapter secretary, a careful man named Dell, who had a gift for saying difficult things in a way that didn't quite say them. Emergency church tomorrow. Denver Clubhouse, 9 a.m. Federal situation. Attendance mandatory. Federal situation. Mace had been a member of the Hells Angels Colorado chapter for 30 years, and in 30 years he had learned that those two words, federal situation, were the sound of a tide going out. They were the sound of brothers starting to calculate, starting to weigh, starting to ask themselves which loyalties were expensive and which were free. He had been through it twice before, once in 2003 and once in 2011, and he knew what the calculations looked like from the inside. He knew how men who called each other brother began to find reasons why this particular situation was different, why this particular choice was not really a choice between loyalty and survival, but between wisdom and foolishness. He had watched good men make those calculations and come out the other side, diminished in ways they never fully named. He set the phone face down on the table and looked at the fire. Outside, the storm had not diminished. If anything, it had gathered itself the way mountain storms do in October, when the cold air coming down off the peaks meets the last warmth of the season and cannot decide between them, and the indecision produces something violent and sustained. The window glass rattled in its frame. A branch somewhere near the house had given way, and he could hear it in the undergrowth below, still moving with the wind. I had come to this cabin 14 months ago after a woman named Darlene, who had been in his life for 6 years and who he had been careless enough to love, was killed in a parking lot in Boulder by men who had nothing to do with Mace, but who existed in the same general world that Mace existed in, and proximity had been enough. He had come to the cabin because it was his grandfather's place, and because it was 15 miles up a road that wasn't on most maps, and because the nearest neighbor in any direction was a black bear family that denned in a limestone outcropping half a mile north and minded their own business considerably better than most people did. I had come to be alone. He had largely succeeded. The dog tags around his neck were warm against his chest. the metal worn smooth from 30 years of contact with skin. Marcus J. Briggs, USMC, blood type O negative. He had stopped wearing them openly sometime in the mid-90s when he traded his dress uniform for leather and chrome, but he had never been able to leave them in a drawer. They were a reminder of the man he had been before the world had gotten its hands on him, before the Corps had made him into something precise and dangerous, and then released him into a civilian life that had no particular use for what he had become. And he had found in the years that followed other structures to belong to other codes, to live inside some of them better than others. The cross on the wall beside the Winchester was his grandfather's work too. The old man had not been a religious man in any institutional sense, had not attended church with any regularity, had not spoken of God in terms that suggested a personal relationship. But he had believed in something that Mace had come to understand over the years was not exactly God, but was adjacent to it. Some principle of accountability that persisted regardless of whether anyone was watching, some standard that a man owed to the world simply by virtue of occupying space in it. Mace had spent 30 years trying to understand where that standard began and where it ended. He was almost asleep in the chair when the knock came. Not a knock exactly, more like a fist making contact with wood and barely having the strength to make it mean anything. Three soft impacts, a pause that lasted the length of a breath held and released, then three more. Mace was out of the chair before the second set finished, moving to the window in the dark, not turning on any lights, his right hand finding the Colt 45 on the shelf beside the door, the way a hand finds a familiar thing it has reached for 10,000 times. The grip was worn smooth in exactly the places where his hand met it. He had carried this weapon for 22 years, and there were nights when putting it down felt like setting down a part of himself. Through the gap in the curtain, he could see the shape of a person on the porch. Slight, wet, standing with the particular stillness of someone who has used up most of what they had just getting to this door and is now conserving what remains. No vehicle in the yard. No other shapes in the darkness beyond the porch railing. No light except the faint silver of the overcast sky and the glow that came through the curtain gap from his kerosene lamp. He looked for 60 seconds, counted the darkness between the trees, listened to the storm and the sounds beneath it, found nothing that wasn't accounted for by weather and the natural movement of a forest in heavy rain. He kept the 45 in his hand and opened the door. She was young or younger than him by a significant distance, and she was soaked through in a way that said she had been walking in this rain for a long while before she arrived here. Not 30 minutes, something closer to 2 hours. Her coat was wool, the expensive kind, the kind that costs enough to make a statement about the life you lived. And it had done its best, but it had not been enough against 2 hours of October mountain rain. Her hair was dark and plastered to her face and neck in strands. Her boots were leather, good ones, the kind built for city streets and well-maintained hiking trails, but the left heel had separated at the sole and flapped when she shifted her weight. Her eyes were green and entirely alert. Most people who came to a stranger's door in the middle of a mountain storm, in the middle of the night, looked desperate, and desperation had a specific quality to it. A looseness around the eyes and mouth, a tendency to speak quickly or not at all. She did not look desperate. She looked like a person who had made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion and was now executing the plan that followed from it with as much precision as the circumstances allowed. The fear was there, he could see it. It was in the set of her jaw and in the way her hands were clasped together in front of her to keep them from shaking. But it was behind something else, something considerably harder, something that had been tested and had held. Mace looked past her into the darkness and the rain, listened again. The storm was loud enough to cover a great deal, but not loud enough to cover everything, and what he heard under it was only the storm. He stepped back from the door. She came inside without speaking, and he closed the door behind her and shot the bolt. And for a moment they simply stood in the amber light of the kerosene lamp, while the rain hammered the windows and the fire made its steady sound, and the Winchester caught the light above the mantel, and the cross beside it threw a small shadow on the log wall. She looked at the rifle, then at the cross beside it, then at him, and the looking was careful and direct in a way that said she had been taught to look at things that way, had learned that the information available in a first look was perishable, and that you could not afford to waste it. He put the 45 back on the shelf. I went to the kitchen and put water on for coffee. He heard her sit down at the table, the chair legs making a small sound on the plank floor. He heard her peel the wet coat off her shoulders and fold it, or try to, because it was heavy with water and did not fold easily. He heard her breathing slow, degree by degree, the particular rhythm of a person moving from immediate danger into something that might provisionally be considered safety. He brought 2 mugs to the table and set one in front of her. Black coffee, no ceremony, no question about how she took it. He sat down across from her and said nothing, because in his experience there were 2 kinds of silence, and she was in the useful kind, the kind where a person organizes themselves before they speak, gathers what they have, and puts it in order. And the worst thing you could do was interrupt it with words that served your own comfort rather than hers. She wrapped both hands around the mug. Her hands were interesting to him. Soft palms, which meant work done at a desk or in a courtroom, rather than with tools or machinery. Short, clean nails. No rings, but on the ring finger of her left hand a band of skin slightly paler than the rest. The unmistakable mark of a ring that had been worn for years and then removed. Not recently removed. The skin had mostly normalized. Maybe 6 months ago. Maybe more. She noticed him looking and pulled her hand back slightly, then stopped herself from doing it. A person editing their own instincts in real time, deciding that the instinct to conceal was less useful than the instinct to be read clearly. He respected that. "My name is Kate," she said. "Kate Sheridan." Her voice was steady despite the cold and the wet, and whatever she had been running from through 2 hours of mountain rain. Educated. The kind of voice that came from good schools and better books, and years of practice at being precise with language, at meaning exactly what you said, and nothing more and nothing less. "Mace Briggs," he said. She nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had already known, as though his name was information she had expected and was now filing in its proper place. "You can stay tonight," he said. "The spare bedroom's upstairs, door locks from the inside." She looked at him over the rim of the mug. Why, he thought about that for a moment. Turned the empty whiskey glass on the table with 2 fingers, a slow rotation that gave his hands something to do while his mind worked. "Because it's raining," he said, "and you knocked." She held his gaze for another moment, long enough to assess something she apparently found satisfactory. Then she looked down at the coffee. Something in her shoulders changed, some architecture of tension that had been holding her upright with muscular effort rather than structural support, shifting into something more sustainable. The difference between a man holding a door closed against pressure and a man who has found the lock. "Thank you," she said. He got up and went to the bedroom on the ground floor, his bedroom, and came back with a flannel shirt, a pair of wool socks, and a towel that had seen better days, but was clean. He set them on the table beside her. He said, "I'll be up by 5. Coffee's on by 5:15. And then he went to the chair by the fire and closed his eyes and listened to her climb the stairs. Each step careful and deliberate, the step of a person who has learned not to make unnecessary noise. He heard the soft sound of the bedroom door, then the click of the lock. He thought that was probably the right call on her part. It would have been the right call on anyone's part in a stranger's house in the middle of the night. I didn't sleep. Not fully. He dozed in the chair the way a man who has spent years in situations requiring alertness learns to doze, one layer of consciousness resting while another remains at the surface monitoring. A Marine sleep, one of his instructors had called it the sleep of a man whose body rests, but whose mind never fully stands down. He had never been able to break the habit, not in 30 years of trying. The storm moved through in waves. By 3 in the morning it had shifted from violent to simply relentless, a steady drumming on the roof that was almost musical. The kind of rain that could go on for days at this altitude in October if the system stalled in the mountains. Twice during the night he heard her moving in the room above him. Once he heard something that might have been a voice, low and truncated, the kind of sound a person makes when a nightmare tries to surface and they catch it before it gets all the way out. the kind of sound that required no intervention because it was not a call for help, but a person managing their own interior weather the best way they knew how. He understood that sound. He had been making a version of it himself for the better part of 3 years. At 5 o'clock, he got up and built the fire back from the coals and put the percolator on and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the pre-dawn darkness. The storm had gentled to something cold and steady, a gray rain that fell straight down, now no longer driven by wind, the kind of rain that settled into the landscape and became part of it. The pines were invisible except where they blocked the slightly lighter dark of the sky. His phone had one new message from Hawk Chapter President, a man he had ridden with since 1994 and trusted as completely as he trusted anyone still living. A man with 35 years of road in his face and the specific quality of leadership that came not from volume or charisma, but from the fact that he had always, without exception, meant exactly what he said. Federal heat is building in the city. Feds asking about safe houses and known associates. You clear up there. Mace looked at the message for a long moment. Typed back, all quiet, routine check. Hawk's reply came in under a minute. Nothing routine about it. Keep your head down. Mace set the phone down and listened to the percolator and thought about what nothing routine about it meant. It meant the kind of federal attention that came with badge numbers and subpoenas and the specific quality of pressure that made entire organizations start looking inward, calculating, deciding what was worth protecting and what could be sacrificed. It meant the kind of situation where the chapter's first obligation was to itself, which was a principle Mace had accepted for 30 years, because it was a principle that generally made sense until it didn't. I was thinking about the boundary between generally making sense and not when he heard her on the stairs at 5:30. She came into the kitchen wearing the flannel shirt, which hung past her hips, and her own pants from the night before, which had dried enough overnight to be wearable. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was scrubbed clean of whatever composure the night had taken from her. And what was underneath was not what he had expected, not the hollowed-out look of someone who had been through something terrible and had not yet decided what to do about it. She looked like a woman who had made peace with something terrible and was now quietly and systematically doing something about it. She sat down at the table and he poured her coffee, and they were silent for a while in the way of two people who have an agreement unspoken but real. That silence is not discomfort, but simply the appropriate container for a morning that has not yet decided what it needs to be. Your father was military, she said finally. It was not a question. He touched the dog tags through his shirt without thinking about it. Marines, he said. 2 tours. Iraq in the Gulf. Long time ago. She looked at her coffee. My father was Army, Ranger. He was killed when I was 16. Afghanistan 2003. He said he was sorry. He meant it without qualification. He taught me things before he deployed, she said. How to read a room, how to watch exits, how to notice what's wrong before you can name it. She paused. How to tell the difference between a man who's dangerous and a man who's dangerous in a particular direction and will not point that direction at you. She looked up at him. He would have liked you, I think. The compliment settled in him in an odd way, arriving at a specific place rather than spreading out the way most compliments do. It was the kind of thing that was either entirely true or not worth saying at all, and she did not seem like a person who said things that were not worth saying. She said, your hands. You've been in firefights. He looked at his hands as though seeing them from her perspective. Scarred knuckles, the accumulation of 30 years of decisions. A burn across the back of the right old and faded from exhaust pipe contact during a long desert ride. Calluses from handlebars, and before that from equipment, and before that from his grandfather's logging tools. A map of every version of himself he had ever been, each version leaving its mark. Some, he said, more than some, she said it gently, without accusation and without performance, as a simple observation about the kind of life the hand suggested. He looked at her and waited. She said, my husband was a federal prosecutor. His name was Daniel. He was working a case against organized crime. Money laundering through construction contracts, government projects, schools and hospitals and roads built with dirty money while children went without textbooks and patients waited in overcrowded hallways. He had been building the case for 3 years, and he was close. He was careful. He was thorough. He understood that evidence assembled over time by careful hands was worth more than any shortcut, and he was willing to take the time that required. She stopped, set her mug down on the table with great precision as though the placement of it mattered. 18 months ago, she said he was driving our children home from a weekend in Steamboat Springs. Amy was 8 years old. She had just learned to ride a bicycle without training wheels. She had been trying for 2 weeks and she figured it out on the Thursday before they left in the parking lot of the elementary school. And she rode the length of it 3 times without falling and came back to Daniel with her face doing something that he described to me that night on the phone as looking like she had just learned a secret about the universe. Her breathing stayed controlled. Each sentence was measured and delivered with the precision of a person who had practiced saying these things many times in the dark alone until the saying of them did not unmake her. Ryan was 6. He had lost his first tooth the week before they drove to Steamboat Springs, and he was still checking the gap with his tongue approximately 40 times a day. He was convinced that the tooth fairy would leave more money if the tooth had come out on a specific day of the week. We never figured out where he got that. It was something he had decided was true. She breathed. The brake line on Daniel's car failed on a mountain grade coming down out of the mountains. They found the car at the bottom of a ravine. They were all killed. Daniel and both of our children. She looked at the fire. I stayed home that weekend because I had the flu. 101 degrees on the Friday morning, and Daniel said, "Stay and rest," and I said I would. I have thought about that flu every single day for the last 18 months. I have thought about what would have happened if I had been well, whether I would have been in the car, whether I would have noticed something wrong with the handling before they reached the grade. I have run those calculations so many times that they no longer produce anything useful, but I cannot stop running them. Mace did not speak. There was nothing to say that would not be less than what she had just put on his table. Some things did not improve with company, and one of them was the weight of specific irreversible loss. He had learned that in the Corps, and he had learned it again in the years since, and he had not forgotten it. I knew it wasn't an accident, she said. Daniel was the most careful driver I had ever known. He had just had the car serviced. He checked his tires every week, every Sunday morning before breakfast, the way some people check their email. He was methodical about everything that could be made methodical. I told the investigators. They did their work, and they found what they said was mechanical failure, consistent with material fatigue, and they closed the file, and I was left with mechanical failure, consistent with material fatigue and 2 children who would not be growing up. She picked up the mug again. But I had Daniel's files. I had his contacts. I had his case notes, which were meticulous and thorough, and which told a story that was not finished. I had 18 months of grief and nothing left to lose, and those turned out to be in their way resources. She reached into the pocket of the flannel shirt and set a small digital camera on the table between them. Its casing was cracked along one edge, a spiderweb of fracture that suggested a fall or a blow. But the LED indicator light was still green and steady. 3 days ago, she said, I was at the federal courthouse in Denver. I was there to deliver documents to Judge Sylvia Crane, who had agreed to authorize a federal investigation based on Daniel's work. She had reviewed what I had assembled, and she believed it was sufficient foundation, and we had arranged to meet to formalize her authorization. I arrived early. The building was not yet fully staffed. The judge's door was slightly open, and as I approached, I heard voices. She looked at the camera. Raymond Voss was in the room with her. Raymond Voss is the man Daniel's investigation was centered on. He runs a criminal organization that has been laundering drug money through Colorado construction contracts for 15 years. He has people in law enforcement at multiple levels. He has people in the judicial system. He has, I believe, people in the federal investigative structure itself. He had almost certainly the investigators who closed Daniel's case. 3 seconds of silence, precise. I watched him take a syringe from his jacket pocket and inject something into the back of Judge Crane's neck. She collapsed within 30 seconds. She convulsed. She stopped moving. And I stood in the hallway of a federal courthouse with a camera in my hand that I had brought to document the authorization meeting, and I recorded all of it. The conversation beforehand, Voss giving instructions to the man with him about how the death would be staged. The injection itself, his voice, his face. She pushed the camera across the table toward him. I have everything, she said. And then I jumped from a second-story window because the man with Voss saw me through the gap in the door, and I have been moving since then. Mace looked at the camera and did not touch it. He said, "How did you get here 15 miles up an unmapped logging road?" She said, "I had Daniel's notes. He mentioned you. Not in the case files. In a personal journal he kept separate from the professional record. He said you were a man who lived outside the law, but inside something else. He said he had thought about that distinction for a long time and had come to believe it mattered more than most people understood. He said he couldn't decide if that made you dangerous or trustworthy." Mace looked at her for a long time. "What did you decide?" he asked. She said, "I decided it made you both, and that both was what I needed." He picked up his phone and looked at Hawk's message again. Federal heat building in the city. Nothing routine about it. He thought about the timing. The chapter receiving federal pressure at the same time, this woman had begun moving toward him through the mountain dark. Coordinates being calculated somewhere. A net being drawn by patient hands. He said, "Someone knew you were coming here before you arrived." She nodded. "I believe so. I believe they have been tracking my movement since I left the courthouse. They know I have the evidence. They know I will try to use it. What they do not know yet is what I have already done with it." He stood and went to the window, looked out at the gray morning, the mist that had replaced the rain, the logging road below just barely visible between the trees. He said, "The camera. Back up." She said, "Everything has been uploaded to a secure server. There is a dead man switch. If I do not authenticate every 12 hours, the files transmit automatically to 47 journalists and to the FBI field office in Washington. Not Denver. Washington." He turned from the window. She looked back at him with the green eyes that had not looked frightened since approximately 10 minutes after she had come through his door. He said, "You're not just a witness." She said, "No. You've been building toward this for 18 months. She said, "Daniel started it. I am finishing it." He stood there for a moment looking at her across the kitchen of his grandfather's cabin at the cross on the wall, and the dog tags on his chest, and the camera on the table between them. And he thought about his grandfather's principle of accountability that persisted regardless of whether anyone was watching. He thought about what it meant that the chain of it ran from a man who had built this cabin in 1961 to a woman who had walked 15 miles through a mountain storm to sit at this table. He turned around. He said, "Then we need to talk about what comes next. But first, you need to eat something." She said, "I'm not hungry." He said, "I didn't ask." She looked at him for a moment. Then something at the corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was related to one, was the thing that smiles come from. High-cooked eggs and toast on the cast-iron skillet in butter with the heat low and patient, the way his grandfather had done it on mornings when the two of them would be heading out into the cold and needed something that would stay with them. She ate everything on the plate and did not comment on it. He ate standing at the counter the way he had eaten most of his meals alone for the past 14 months. They were halfway through the planning of a provisional next step, Mace outlining the defensive positions of the cabin and the escape routes he knew, and Kate explaining the digital architecture of her dead man switch in the precise vocabulary of a woman who had thought through every contingency when the sound came from outside. Not the storm. The storm had mostly passed. Boots on gravel, more than one set. Moving in a pattern, he recognized the way he recognized certain things about himself, because he had moved that way himself in other places in years. When the mission was what organized the darkness, and the question of what came next had a clear and tactical answer. Standard surround formation. One designated announcer positioned at the primary approach, the others holding at secondary positions covering angles waiting. I was out of the chair before he had made the conscious decision to stand. He crossed to the window and looked through the gap in the curtain and counted. 3 men on the south side, a shape near the tree line at the north. The way they held their weapons close and ready said these were not men who expected resistance to be a formality. The knock came, heavy, measured, federal in its rhythm but wrong in its specific execution, the timing of men who had learned the sound of authority without understanding its source. U.S. Marshals, open the door, open the PEM. High had dealt with actual federal marshals 3 times in his life, and he knew their rhythms the way a musician knows the difference between a player who has learned the notes and one who understands the music. They announced warrant numbers. They stated specific names. They maintained a formal distance from the door because the training and the liability both required it. These men were pressed too close. Their spacing was tactical rather than procedural. The one speaking had the flat certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed in contexts where law enforcement credentials were not actually the source of that obedience. We know she's in there, Donovan. The name wrong on the first try. Testing or careless or both. Send her out and nobody gets hurt. Kate was beside him close enough that he could hear her breathing. Her breathing was controlled in and out in the deliberate rhythm of someone who had been taught to manage their physical response to stress. Her hand was steady on the edge of the windowsill. He met her eyes and she gave him a single small nod. She had known this was coming. She had been ready for it longer than he had because she had been living inside the knowledge of it for 3 days, and he had been living inside it for approximately 4 hours. He moved to the gun cabinet, Winchester off the wall, already loaded, the lever action smooth and certain. Shotgun from the cabinet, which he handed to her without ceremony, and she took it without ceremony and checked the action with the efficiency of someone who had been taught correctly and had not forgotten. He registered again that she was not a person who needed things explained to her. Last chance, Donovan. Still wrong. We just want the girl. He did not speak. He moved to the far end of the kitchen and crouched and put 2 fingers on the iron ring set into the floor. The trap door to the root cellar. The tunnel that ran 40 yards through the mountain dirt to emerge behind the woodshed dug during Prohibition by men who had understood the value of exits that nobody knew about. His grandfather had found it when he bought the property, had spent 3 years shoring up the walls, clearing the passage, lining the worst sections with timber. Had never explained why he spent that time and effort on something he claimed not to need. But Mace had come to appreciate over the years the wisdom of men who prepared for situations they hoped would never arise. The preparation was the thing that let you sleep. He looked at Kate. He said, the tunnel comes out behind the woodshed. My bike is under the tarp on the east side of the shed. You know how to ride, she said, I'll figure it out. He said, you won't have to. He took the kerosene lamp from the counter and threw it against the far wall, and the kerosene caught with a sound like an intake of breath, and the fire spread quickly along the dry timber, filling the room with orange light and the sharp smell of burning. Go, he said. The front door came in with a sound like a rifle shot, the hinges giving way in a cascade of splinters, and the solid mass of the door swinging inward and hitting the wall. And Mace put 2 rounds from the shotgun through the kitchen doorway at chest height without targeting anything specific, just buying the seconds that mattered. And then he was through the trap door and into the cold dark of the tunnel, with his fingers on the rough timbered walls, and Kate moving ahead of him in the dark, with a sureness that said she had already memorized the relevant information. The tunnel smelled of 100 years of mountain earth and old timber and the particular cold that lives underground even in summer. It was low enough that he had to move at a crouch and narrow enough that his shoulders brushed both walls. Behind him, through the trapdoor and through the floor of the burning cabin, he could hear shouting and the crash of furniture being overturned, and the sound of men learning that what they had come for was not where they had expected it to be. He had learned a long time ago in places considerably hotter and louder than a Colorado mountain that the advantage in any engagement belongs to the side that does not behave as expected. You did not let them set the terms. You chose the ground, and you set the terms yourself, and if you could not choose the ground, you changed it. They came out of the tunnel into the cold gray morning behind the woodshed, both of them breathing harder than they would have liked, and he pulled the tarp off the Harley and felt the familiar geometry of the machine under his hands, the weight and balance of it, and hit the electric start, and listen to it, catch and settle into its idle. The sound of controlled power 1200 cc of American engine telling the morning it had arrived. Kate climbed on behind him without being asked. Her arms came around his waist and locked there with a grip that was firm and deliberate and not panicked. The grip of a person who has decided to commit to a direction and has committed. He felt the warmth of her against his back and the steadiness of the grip. And he thought of Darlene for 1/2 second, the way Darlene had held on in exactly this way on a different road in a different year. And then he put that thought exactly where it needed to go and opened the throttle. The Harley came out from behind the woodshed and laid itself onto the narrow mountain path and behind them through the trees. The cabin was burning against the gray morning sky. 14 months of carefully chosen solitude, going up in kerosene and cedar smoke. He did not look at it. He had already understood somewhere in the 45 minutes since Kate Sheridan had knocked on his door that the cabin was not something he was going back to, and the burning of it was simply the universe confirming what he had already registered. A black SUV burst from the tree line, 200 yards down the logging road, cutting across the path at an angle designed to block it. Mace read the geometry in the half-second he had and yanked the bars hard, left the bike going sideways in a controlled slide across the loose gravel, his left boot scraping the ground, the rear tire skating, and then finding purchase. And then he had it aimed up a deer trail that cut north and parallel to the road, steep enough that the SUV's weight and wheelbase made it impossible to follow. Gunfire behind them. Muzzle flash visible in his mirrors brief in orange in the gray light. The rounds went wide of them in the space because shooting accurately from a vehicle at a motorcycle that has just departed in an unexpected direction is a skill that most people, even trained people, do not consistently achieve. She held on. They came down off the mountain as the sun cleared the eastern peaks and laid its pale October light across the highway below, and he accelerated onto the asphalt and felt the road and the speed and the particular forward quality of motion that had been for most of his adult life the closest thing to peace he reliably had access to. The Denver chapter clubhouse sat on the western edge of the city behind 10-foot chain link topped with razor wire, its security cameras tracking every approach, its parking lot carrying 40 years of chrome and leather, and the accumulated weight of a culture that had decided early to exist outside the structures that governed other people's lives and had been paying the associated costs ever since. He pulled through the gate with Kate's hands still locked at his waist and killed the engine and let the silence of the city come in around them. Kate said quietly, "Is this safe?" he said, "for now." He said it carefully because he was already beginning to understand that the question of what was safe had become substantially more complicated than it had been 24 hours ago, and that the complications had not yet finished arriving. Hawk met them in the parking lot, 6'4" and built like something that had been assembled rather than born, 35 years of road in every line of his face. He looked at Mace and then at Kate, and then back at Mace with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. He has been doing long enough to know that he's not going to like the answer. "Heard you had some trouble up at your place," he said. Mace said, "You could put it that way." Hawk lowered his voice in the way of a man who is choosing his words in front of an audience. "He has not yet evaluated. Federal heat is getting specific. They're asking about you by name and about safe houses and about associates. Whatever this is, it's large enough to make the whole organization nervous." Mace said she witnessed Raymond Voss murder a federal judge. With evidence. Hawk's jaw tightened. The name Voss carried its own specific weight in circles like this one, the weight of a man who had demonstrated over many years that the line between criminal enterprise and legitimate power was navigable by anyone with sufficient resources and sufficient patience. He said, "And you brought her here." Mace said she had nowhere else to go. Hawk looked at Kate for a long moment. Kate looked back at him with the same direct steadiness she had been deploying since she came through the cabin door. The look of a person who has decided that they have nothing left to lose from being exactly who they are. Hawk said to her, "You understand what this place is?" She said, "I understand it's the first door someone opened for me in 3 days. And I understand that the man who opened it did not have to." Hawk looked back at Mace. Mace could see the algebra of it happening in real time. The chapter president's calculation, the brotherhood arithmetic that every president had to perform eventually when an individual member's situation created pressure on the collective. He had watched Hawk do it before. He had never been the member whose situation was creating the pressure. He said church, 1 hour. The meeting room was a long table folding chairs. The chapter charter framed on the wall between two photographs that had accumulated there over 30 years, and which Mace could have described in their precise detail even in the dark. 12 men filed in. Hawk laid out the situation in 4 sentences, and then the room went very quiet in the specific way of rooms where men are deciding things they would prefer not to have to decide. The vote took 11 minutes, 7-5 to cut ties, to put Mace on the outside with whatever he had walked into, which was the chapter's right and possibly its obligation, and which he had understood was a possible outcome from the moment he had stepped back from his front door and let Kate Sheridan come inside. He had expected something like this. He had known the mathematics of brotherhood for 30 years. He had not expected it to feel exactly like this. The specific gravity of 30 years setting down around him, not violently, but with the absolute finality of a door that closes without drama, but does not open again. He stood. He unbuttoned the vest with hands that were steady because he had decided they would be steady, and 30 years of discipline meant that the body generally did what he decided. He took it off. He laid it on the table with the patches face up, the Colorado bottom rocker that had been his geography for 3 decades, the winged death's head that had been his flag. He set it down, and he did not slam it, and he did not make a speech because the vest deserved better than anger, and so did the men watching him lay it down, even the 7 who had voted against him, because they had voted for the organization's survival in the way they understood it, and that was not nothing. He walked to the door, and then he stopped, one hand on the frame, because something was wrong with the quality of the silence at his back. Not the silence of finality, which had one particular texture. Something else. Something that made the instincts that had kept him alive in the Gulf and in Bosnia and in 30 years of another kind of conflict stand up and pay careful attention. He turned. Hawk was standing at the far end of the table, not sitting, not looking at the other members, looking at Mace. His hands were at his sides. His face had the look of a man who has voted for the thing that needed to be voted for and found that it tastes exactly as bad as he thought it would, and he is neither surprised by the taste nor relieved by it. He held Mace's gaze for 7 seconds, did not speak, did not move, did not look away. Mace read that silence the way he had learned to read a great many things over the course of a life spent paying attention, and what it said was not what the vote had said. It said something older than the vote and more durable, something that had been between these two men since 1994 and was not going to be resolved by a ballot count. He walked out into the cold morning air. Kate was waiting beside the bike with his spare jacket around her shoulders, her arms folded against the cold that had followed the rain. She looked at him when he came through the door at the place where the vest was not, and she understood immediately what that meant, and did not ask him to explain it, and did not offer the kind of comfort that would require him to receive it. She just said, "What now?" He stood there for a moment in the parking lot of the place that had been his home for 30 years, feeling the particular lightness of a man who has set down a weight so familiar that he had stopped noticing it was there until the moment it was gone. He said, "Now we go somewhere they won't think to look, and we figure out how to end this." He handed her the helmet. She put it on with the efficiency of a person who wastes nothing. He started the Harley, and they left the city moving west toward the mountains, the bike laying a clean line across the highway, while the Rockies rose ahead of them in the October light, massive and permanent and perfectly indifferent to the decisions of men. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The wind was cold, and the road was mostly empty, and behind them somewhere, the cabin was still burning, and ahead of them, in the abandoned silence of a ghost town called Copper Falls, they were going to have to figure out what came next. And neither of them knew yet what that would look like, only that it would require everything they had, and possibly more than that. But for the moment, there was only the road and the speed and the mountains, and her hands locked around his waist, and the dog tags warm against his chest, and the small, precise fact of a decision already made and already in motion. The kind that simply requires that you be equal to it. Copper Falls had been a silver mining town once, in the years when men came to the Colorado mountains with dynamite and ambition and the particular brand of hope that doesn't survive prolonged contact with geology. The silver ran out in 1891, and the people left with what they could carry, and the buildings stayed slowly becoming something other than what they had been built to be, something that belonged more to the mountain and the weather than to any human purpose. The main street was still recognizable as a street, the false front buildings still standing on both sides. But the wood had gone gray as old bone, and the roof lines had begun their long negotiation with gravity, and the whole place had the quality of a photograph that has been left in the sun too long, the image fading back toward blankness. Mace guided the Harley down the center of the main street and killed the engine and let the silence come in around them. It was a particular kind of silence, the silence of a place that had been filled with noise and human intention once and had forgotten what that felt like. Wind moved through the empty window frames and made a low, sustained sound, not quite a moan, more like the sound of the mountain breathing through something hollow. A hawk circled something in the valley below, patient and methodical the way predators circle when they are not yet committed to the descent. Kate climbed off the bike and stood in the middle of the street and looked at the buildings with the systematic attention she applied to most things. Not sightseeing. Assessment. She said, "How did you know about this place?" Mace swung his leg off and stood feeling the road in his hips and back, the way he always felt it after a long stretch at speed. "My grandfather's mining claim," he said. "Original deed goes back to 1887. He never worked it, but he held the title because he was a man who held what he had and did not let things go simply because they had stopped being immediately useful. He left it to my father, and my father left it to me in the way men leave things to sons when the sons were not the life they had planned." He looked at the buildings. At the assay office at the far end of the street, stone built where everything else was wood, because the men who built it understood that certain things needed to survive the fire that eventually came for everything else. "I've been using it as a contingency for about 12 years," he said. She said, "A contingency." He said, "In my experience, the difference between a man with options and a man without them is the work he did before he needed the options." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come on," and she was already moving toward the assay office with the purposeful stride of a woman who had not come here to admire the architecture. The assay office had a hasp and padlock that Mace opened with a key he had never removed from his ring in 12 years, because you did not remove the key to the last door between you and no options at all. Inside, the afternoon light came through 4 windows coated with a decade's accumulation of dust, throwing everything into a gray-amber half-light. A table, 2 chairs, a cast iron stove along the east wall that was still functional because Mace had cleaned and maintained it on each of his visits here. Because a stove that didn't work when you needed it was worse than no stove at all. Cots along the west wall with folded wool blankets, a shelf of canned provisions dated and rotated on schedule. And in the north wall, behind a loose stone at knee height, wrapped in oiled canvas, sealed with electrical tape, and placed with the care of a man who intended it to be found in exactly this condition whenever it was needed, the Winchester Model 94 that had belonged to his grandfather's grandfather, a rifle that had been maintained across 4 generations, not as a relic, but as a tool, because the men in his family had understood the difference. He pulled the stone and retrieved the package and unwrapped it on the table. The rifle was exactly as he had left it 14 months ago. Walnut stock smooth with age and used steel of the barrel, lightly oiled the mechanism moving when he worked it with the clean certainty of something that has been properly cared for. Kate was already moving through the space the way she moved through every space with systematic attention, checking windows, angles, lines of sight, the geometry of approach and defense. She found a coil of old telegraph wire on the shelf beside the provisions and held it up. He said the mine ran telegraph to the main shaft, probably 1880s wire, still conductive. She said, "How many tin cans do you have?" He counted the shelf. 6. She nodded, working through something. My father used to set perimeter alarms with wire and cans when we camped in the backcountry. He said the best early warning system was the one that required no batteries and no electricity and no maintenance other than knowing where it was. She said it in the even tone that cost her something, the kind of evenness that is not natural, but is purchased with a great deal of practice in saying things that hurt without letting the hurt redirect the sentence. He opened the stove and built a fire with the wood stacked against the east wall. The heat spread into the stone room the way heat moves when the walls are thick enough to earn it gradual, and then committed the kind of warmth that settles into the bones rather than just touching the surface. Kate worked the perimeter alarm with a concentration that made the space around her quiet, her hands moving through the motions of her father's lesson with a muscle memory that had survived 18 months and what he suspected survived considerably more. When the alarm was set and the fire was established, he heated 2 cans of soup on the stove. They ate at the table without ceremony in the growing warmth of the stone room. After a while, he said, "Tell me the rest of it." She looked at him over her spoon. He said, "You told me the outline this morning. The case, the judge, what you recorded. But you haven't told me the part that brought you to my specific door. Daniel mentioned me. But there's more than that. Men who are about to authorize federal investigations don't leave notes in their personal journals about retired outlaw bikers unless there's a reason that's specific enough to write down." She set the spoon down, put her hands flat on the table, a gesture he had come to recognize as her version of taking a deliberate breath before something that required it. She said Daniel's case was not only about the money laundering, it was about the mechanism, about how Voss's organization maintained its control over the legal system, not by corrupting every official it encountered, but by identifying which officials were vulnerable, creating leverage, and maintaining it with a precision that was almost institutional. Daniel had documented 37 separate officials at various levels who were operating under Voss's influence: federal judges, prosecutors at the state and federal level, law enforcement administrators, people placed or positioned within the system specifically to provide protection for Voss's operations. She paused. She said one of them was inside the FBI Denver field office. Daniel did not know who. He had narrowed it to 3 people. He was working toward a conclusion when he died. Mace said, which means when you continued his work, you were operating in a space where at least one person with federal investigative resources was in a position to watch for exactly that. She said yes. He said, and you did it anyway. She said Daniel spent 3 years building that case. Amy and Ryan died because of what he was building. I was not going to permit that to be meaningless. The fire made its sound. Outside, the wind moved through the empty buildings of Copper Falls with a low, impatient note, the sound of the mountain practicing its indifference. He said, how much of what you know did you share with anyone before you came here? She said, no one. I did not trust anyone with the specifics. I did not trust anyone at all for the most part. He said, then the leak that got Daniel killed didn't come from you. She said, no, it came from inside his office. Someone who had access to his case files and his calendar, and to the specific details of the meeting he had arranged with Judge Crane. Someone who told Voss that Daniel was close enough to constitute a real problem, and then told Voss about the judge. Mace turned his mug on the table, slowly watching the steam rise from it. He said, the same someone who has been tracking you since you left the courthouse 3 days ago. She said yes. He said, when you set up the dead man switch, you directed it to Washington, not Denver. She said, Daniel taught me that if you don't know which door the problem came through, you don't use any door you've already used. You find a window. He looked at her across the firelit table for a moment. Then he got up and went outside into the cold dark to make a call. He found one bar of signal at the far end of the main street and pulled up a number he had not used in 4 years. It rang 3 times. The voice that answered had the quality of a man who had spent 20 years teaching people how to stay alive in places designed to kill them, and had achieved a kind of authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with demonstrated competence. You've got some nerve using this number, the voice said. Figured you were probably dead by now, devil dog. Mace said, still working on that. Gunny, I need a favor of the old kind. Taggart said, define old kind. Mace said, federal witness to a high-profile murder. Defensible position in the mountains. Professional operators on the way. Marines required. A pause of the kind that contained calculation rather than hesitation. How many hostiles unknown at this point? Well-armed, trained, probably former military themselves. Rules of engagement. Mace looked back at the lit window of the assay office at the shape of Kate moving inside at the amber light on the stone walls of a building that had survived 130 years of Colorado weather and the ambitions of men. He said, whatever it takes to protect the innocent and see this evidence to the people who should have it. Taggart said, coordinates and timeline. I can have 8 men by tomorrow night. Mace gave him what he needed and hung up and stood for a moment in the cold mountain dark with the stars overhead, the altitude making each one precise and very far away, the kind of stars that make the distances between things feel honest. He thought about what 8 Marines could do in a defensible position against professional operators who were good but not Marines. He thought the mathematics were improving. He went back inside. Kate was at the table with the digital camera and a laptop he had not seen before, slim and battered, which she had apparently been carrying in the inside pocket of the wool coat since she arrived. She was working with the focus of a person who knows exactly what they are doing and is doing it against a clock. He sat down and waited. She said without looking up, second dead man switch. Different server, different distribution list. FBI Washington, 15 news organizations, and Senator William Greer of Wyoming, who was Daniel's law school mentor and whose clean status Daniel specifically documented because he had verified it 3 separate times and trusted the verification. She hit a key and closed the laptop. She said, if we both fail to authenticate every 6 hours, everything transmits automatically to all of them simultaneously. He said, good. She looked at him. Did you reach someone? He said, 8 Marines, 2nd Battalion veterans. They'll be here by tomorrow night. Something in her face changed, something held at a careful maintenance angle, relaxing by a specific and measurable degree. She said, you were serious about the Marines. He said, I'm serious about most things. It's a character flaw I've tried to address and haven't managed to. She looked at him. The firelight moved across her face. She said, that is not a flaw. They were quiet for a while. The perimeter wire ran from the assay office door out through the dark, connected to the tin cans Kate had positioned at the primary approach points, each one filled with the coarse gravel from outside the door. Not elaborate, but sufficient to turn silence into information in the seconds that determine outcomes. He got up and added wood to the fire and sat back down, and the heat deepened in the stone room. Kate reached into the pocket of the flannel shirt and set the wedding ring on the table. It was a simple band of yellow gold worn smooth from years of contact with everything she had touched in her married life. She set it down and looked at it with the attention of a person reading something they have read many times and are still reading. She said this was Daniel's mother's ring. She gave it to us when we married, said she had worn it through 40 years, and it had held everything she asked of it, and she wanted it to hold more. She turned it once with one finger. She said Amy used to try it on. It fit her to the first knuckle. She said it was her practice ring. She said she was going to have one just like it when she grew up. She had decided this at the age of 6, and there was no indication she had any intention of revising the decision. Her voice did not break. It carried what it was carrying without breaking under it, which was its own kind of strength. He said nothing. She said, I took it off 3 months after they died because I could not stop looking at it. Then I put it back because not looking at it was worse. Then I took it off again when I started working Daniel's files in earnest because I needed to be able to think about the case without thinking about everything the ring represented, and I found I could not do both at once. She picked it up and held it between her fingers. She said, I've been carrying it in my pocket for 11 months. He said, that's a long time. She said, grief doesn't have a schedule. He said, no, it doesn't. She looked at him. She said, how long for you? He said, 14 months since Darlene. But she was the last of a series of losses that I handled badly going back considerably further, so the arithmetic on it is complicated. She said, "Are you still handling it badly?" He considered that with the seriousness it deserved. He said, "I'm handling it differently. Whether differently is better, I can't say with confidence yet." She nodded and put the ring back in her pocket. She said, "What was she like?" He thought about Darlene, which he did not do often because it had not been productive, but which he had learned in the last year was its own kind of wound, the not doing of it, and that the wound did not improve with avoidance. He said she was a straight talker. She had no patience for conversations where nobody said what they meant. She called me on things in ways that most people were too careful to do, and she was usually right when she did it, which made the calling harder to dismiss and more valuable. He paused. He said, "She knew what I was, and she did not ask me to be something else, and she did not pretend the thing I was didn't have costs. She just stayed until she couldn't stay." Kate said, "She sounds like someone worth grieving properly." He said, "Yeah, she was." The fire crackled. Outside, one of the tin cans moved in the wind, a faint rattle that resolved itself into weather and not footsteps. He listened to it resolve and returned his attention to the room. She said, "My father used to say that the most dangerous thing in any situation wasn't the visible enemy. It was the uncertainty that made you hesitate when hesitation was the thing that would kill you." He said, "Smart man." She said he was. He also said that the only way to operate effectively under uncertainty was to get completely clear on the one thing you were absolutely certain of. The anchor. The thing you came back to when everything else was complicated. She looked at the fire. She said, "For 18 months, my anchor was Amy and Ryan, getting justice for them, ensuring that Voss couldn't do to another family what he did to mine. That was sufficient to function on." She paused. She said, "But somewhere in the last 48 hours, it has become something else as well. Something additional, and I am not entirely certain what to do with that." She said it plainly, the way she said everything without performance, as an honest report on an observation she had made about her own interior state and was now reporting accurately. He looked at her for a moment, then at the fire. He said, "We deal with what's in front of us, one thing at a time." She said yes. He said, "What's in front of us right now is a man with substantial resources and a demonstrated willingness to kill judges and children who knows we have evidence that ends him. That's the anchor." She said yes. "That's the anchor." He said, "Everything else waits." She said yes. A pause, and then she said, "But it's there." He said, "I know." They sat with that for a while, the fire doing its work, the wind moving through Copper Falls outside the October stars, coming out through the dusty windows, and doing what light does when it has a great distance to travel before it reaches anything. He woke at 4 in the morning to a tin can rattling 3 feet from the door of the assay office. Twice then quiet. I was out of the cot with the 45 in his hand before he was fully upright. Kate was already awake on the other cot, the shotgun in her hands in the trained carry position of someone who had been taught correctly and whose body had retained the instruction across however many years of not using it. He held up 2 fingers, 2 approach angles. She nodded. I went to the south window and looked through the dust and the darkness and counted shapes between the false front buildings across the street. 3 visible. One more near the vehicles at the south end of the street. Moving with the patience of men who had been taught that patience was the variable that separated professional outcomes from amateur ones. 6 in the initial wave. 2 hanging back as insurance. He moved to Kate and leaned close and kept his voice to a thread. 6 coming, 2 in reserve, former military movement pattern. They're going to try to take the south and east windows simultaneously. She said at the same volume. How long? He said, 4 minutes, 5 if they're cautious. She said, are they cautious? He said, they're good, but they don't know what they're walking into. I went to the canvas bag he had packed the night before, while Kate slept 12 sticks of industrial explosive from the powder magazine cache, old and stable, and checked by his own hands. Kate looked at the bag without surprise. She said, I need the east window. He said, anyone comes through that window, you put them down. She said, I won't hesitate. She said it in a tone that was not a performance of toughness, but a simple, factual statement about her current state of mind. I believed her completely. The fight lasted 11 minutes. It was loud and close and happened in the dark and the cold and the sharp smell of discharge and stone dust. And when it was over, two of Voss's men would not be reporting anything to anyone. Three had retreated to the vehicles and pulled back down the mountain road at a speed that said their instructions had not covered this scenario, and one was sitting against the south wall of the assay office with his wrists zip-tied behind him and a cut above his eye that was bleeding with conviction. Mace crouched in front of him. He said, you're going to tell me who sent you? The man said no. Mace said, that's your choice. But the woman behind me has been waiting 18 months for an occasion to stop being patient, and I'm not confident in my ability to moderate that indefinitely. Kate said nothing at all. She simply looked at the man from across the room with the shotgun in the crook of her arm and the expression of a woman who has been through the specific thing she has been through and is operating in a register that is several floors below fear. Whatever he saw in her face was apparently sufficient data. After a moment, he looked away from her. He said, Price. Agent Price. He ran the location. He's been tracking you since the courthouse. Mace said Callan Price. The man said, I don't know his first name. Just Price. He's Voss's primary coordinator inside the federal structure. Mace stood. Kate said quietly, he knew Daniel. He had access to specifics that only someone inside the investigative process would have known. That's how Voss knew the details of the meeting with Judge Crane. Not a general leak, a specific person with specific access who had been watching Daniel's case from the inside for a long time. Mace said, and Price knows we're here. She said, he's known since we arrived. Mace looked at the man against the wall. He said, when do you check in? The man said 6 a.m. With the particular resignation of someone who has concluded that cooperation is the option with the lowest remaining cost. It was 4:47. Mace looked at Kate. She was already thinking through it. He could see the movement of it in her face, the way she organized available information, the way she had been trained to organize it. She said, he'll know something went wrong when the check-in doesn't come in. He said, unless the check-in comes in. She looked at him. He picked up the burner phone he had taken from the man against the wall. 3 contacts listed by initial only. He turned it in his hands, reading the situation through the object. He said, we have about an hour to decide what we do with this. They made the decision in 20 minutes. Mace typed the message himself, keeping it brief and in the terse shorthand of men who communicate under operational pressure. Package not acquired. Position compromised. Suggest change of approach. The response came in 4 minutes. Meet at Holloway Creek Rest Stop. Route 40. Come alone. Mace showed Kate the screen. She said he wants to consolidate. He's concerned about exposure. Mace said he'll want to handle this himself rather than send another team. Cleaner trail, more control. She said he won't actually come alone. He'll have insurance in the tree line. He said yes. She said we could run. He said where to? She said he'd follow. He has the resources to follow indefinitely, and we don't have the resources to stay ahead of that indefinitely. He said, that's my assessment too. She said, so we go to the rest stop. He said, we go to the rest stop. But we go having chosen the ground which changes the mathematics. He called Gunny Taggart. Taggart picked up on the first ring. He said 2 hours out. Mace said Holloway Creek rest stop on Route 40. 8:30, concealed approach, full load. Taggart said, you found your man. Mace said he's found us. We're going to let him believe he has the advantage until the moment he discovers he doesn't. Taggart said Marines are on the road, devil dog. Don't do anything characteristically stupid before we arrive. Mace said define characteristically stupid. Taggart said you know exactly what it looks like. You've done it before and I've had to extract you from the consequences. He hung up. Kate was watching him from across the room. He said 8 Marines, 2 hours. She said, you trust them. He said, I've trusted them with my life specifically. On multiple occasions. I'm still here, which speaks to the quality of the trust. She said, "How long have you known Taggart?" He said, "Since 1991. He was my gunnery sergeant in the Gulf. He had a very specific gift for explaining the difference between the tactically inadvisable and the merely terrifying in a way that helped you tell them apart when it mattered." She said, "Did he think you were an idiot?" Mace said frequently. He was usually wrong. Occasionally he wasn't. He has a long memory for the occasions when he wasn't. The corner of her mouth moved. He said, "Sleep for the next hour." She said, "I won't sleep." He said, "Then rest. Keep the shotgun reachable." She said, "Mace." He stopped. She said, "When this is over, when Voss is in custody and the evidence is in the right hands and the people who should answer for it are answering, what do you do?" I thought about the cabin that was ash, the patch on the table, the dog tags and the Winchester and the chair by the fire that had been his whole world for 14 months and was now smoke and memory. He said, "I don't know yet." That's the honest answer. She said, "That is the most honest thing most people never say." He said, "What about you?" She said, "Same. I have been running toward this for long enough that I haven't thought clearly about what's past it." Daniel used to say that was a characteristic failure mode of prosecutors mistaking the verdict for the destination. She paused. She said, "I need to find out what the destination actually looks like." He said, "Yeah." He said it quietly. He meant more than one thing by it. She heard both things. She lay down on the cot and put the shotgun within arm's reach and closed her eyes. He sat in the chair by the door with the 45 on his knee and watched the darkness outside the dusty windows begin to change by slow and incremental degrees as the high Colorado morning came on, cold and clear and perfectly indifferent to everything that was about to happen inside it. The tin cans were still, the wire was taut. The mountains stood where they had always stood before any of this, before any of the decisions that had led to this room, and they would stand thereafter. He turned the dog tags over in his fingers in the dark and thought about all the things he had done and all the things he had not done, and the specific and improbable sequence of events that had led to a woman sleeping on a cot in an abandoned assay office in a ghost town while he sat guard. I thought his grandfather would have found nothing to object to in this. He thought that was about as much as a man could reasonably ask for. He watched the sky lighten and waited for 8 o'clock. The Holloway Creek rest stop sat at the junction of Route 40 and a county road that went nowhere in particular. A concrete pavilion and two picnic tables in a parking area surrounded on three sides by pine forest and on the fourth by a limestone outcropping that rose 30 feet above the parking surface. A man who thought tactically would find the outcropping immediately useful. Mace had found it useful standing on top of it at 7:45 with the Winchester across his back and Taggart's voice in his earpiece running through the final positioning of 8 men who moved through pine forest with the economy of people who had been doing this for a long time in places where the cost of doing it wrong was not abstract. North tree line, Taggart said. Briggs, Shaw, and Kowalski. East tree line, Reyes and Drummond. You have Overwatch on the rock. I'll be mobile. The rest stop is your stage. Anyone comes through that lot who isn't the target we hold. Your call on the engage order. Mace said, "Understood." Taggart said, "One more thing." Mace said, "Yeah." Taggart said, "The woman. She's staying with you on the stage." Mace said, "She insisted." Taggart was quiet for a moment. He said, "Your grandfather would have liked her." Mace said, "Several people have said something along those lines recently." He climbed down from the rock and found Kate at the edge of the parking area, standing with her back to the limestone, and the recovered Glock she'd taken from Price's man held low in her right hand, in the grip of someone for whom a weapon was a tool rather than a statement. She had the collar of his spare jacket turned up against the cold, and her eyes were on the tree line. She said without looking at him, "All 8 are in position." He said, "All 8. She said, "Price will have 2 or 3. He'll want to keep the footprint small because a large operation creates a larger evidence trail, and he's been managing evidence trails for 11 years. He said, "That's what I think." She said, "He'll be confident. He's never been in a situation he couldn't control because he's always had the information advantage." He's never operated against someone who knew what he was before he arrived. Mace said he doesn't have that advantage today. She said no, he doesn't. She looked at him then, in the flat gray October light in the jacket that was 3 sizes too large for her. She looked like a person who had been reduced to exactly what was essential and had found that what was essential was sufficient, more than sufficient. He said, when he gets out of the vehicle, let me take the first exchange. I want him comfortable with the situation. Men like Price, men who have been running things from the inside for a long time. They need to explain themselves when they finally have an audience they can be honest with. They've been in the secret too long. Daniel understood that. He built his entire interrogation approach on it. She looked at him sharply. He said, I read his case notes, the ones on the laptop, last night while you slept. She said quietly, he was exceptional at that. He said he was. He wrote like a man who understood precisely what he was doing and why it mattered and what the stakes were. He would have been very angry about how long this has taken. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said he would have been proud of who finished it. She straightened and her grip on the recovered Glock settled from tightness into readiness, which were different things, and the difference was everything. They heard the vehicle at 8:53, a black government-issue sedan moving down the county road at the speed of controlled authority. It pulled into the parking area and sat for 45 seconds with the engine running, which was a man inside doing a thorough visual assessment before committing to the space. The engine cut. The door opened. Colin Price was tall and lean, with a face specifically engineered by nature or by practice to be unremarkable in any context, the kind of face that occupied rooms without being remembered by them. His suit was expensive in the way of a man who understood that certain things needed to signal membership in specific categories. His FBI credentials case was on his belt, the shield catching the pale morning light with the precision of something that had been designed to catch light in exactly that way. He moved with the ease of a man who had been the most capable person in every difficult situation he had entered for a long time. He looked at Mace first. He said, Mr. Briggs, I appreciate you choosing to be reasonable about this. Mace said I try to be reasonable when the situation permits. Price looked at Kate. He said, Ms. Sheridan, I'm genuinely glad you're safe. After everything you've endured. He said it with warmth that was in its way entirely real. That was the thing about men like that, Mace thought. The warmth was not manufactured. It was simply in service of something that had nothing to do with her welfare. Kate said, thank you, Agent Price. Price said, I have a secure federal facility 40 minutes from here. Once we have the camera and the digital materials in proper federal custody, we can begin the witness protection process. New identities within 36 hours for both of you. He said it the way a man says a thing he has said before and found effective. Mace said before any of that. I have some questions. Price said, of course. That's entirely reasonable. I use the word reasonable the way a man uses a word he has learned produces a specific response. Mace said, how did you know we were at Copper Falls? Price said, we've had surveillance assets tracking Ms. Sheridan's movement continuously since she left the courthouse. Standard protocol for witness protection situations. Mace said standard protocol. Price said that's correct. Mace said the team that came to Copper Falls last night. Were they yours? Something moved behind Price's eyes, a very small and very fast recalibration, the adjustment of a man who has walked into a conversation that has slightly different terrain than he expected. He said we had an extraction team attempting to make contact. Mace said they came in at 4 in the morning, in full tactical gear, without announcing warrant numbers or identification. Price said operational security requirements. Kate said, what's your badge number? She said it in the tone of someone who has been waiting for the precise moment to say a specific thing and has recognized that moment and said it. Price looked at her. The warmth did not disappear from his face so much as get deliberately moved aside, stored somewhere it would not interfere with what was coming next. He said, I'm sorry. She said, your badge number. Daniel taught me that standard practice when working with a new federal contact is to verify badge numbers independently. He was very specific about this. He said it was the single most important habit a federal prosecutor's family could develop. The 45 seconds that followed were the quietest that Mace had experienced in a situation that was not yet resolved, and he had experienced considerable quiet in a great many situations. Then Price reached into his jacket, and his hand came out with a Glock 19 instead of a credentials case, and the FBI shield on his belt fell to the concrete with the hollow sound of a cheap reproduction hitting stone, and whatever had been warm in his face was entirely gone. He said Raymond Voss sends his regards. Kate did not flinch. Price kept the weapon on her. He said the camera, the laptop, whatever server you uploaded to, you're going to revoke all of it. Right now. Kate said, that's not possible. Price said everything is possible with sufficient motivation. He said it with the flat efficiency of a man who had provided motivation of this kind before and found it to be a reliable tool. Mace said Price. Price kept his eyes and his weapon on Kate, but said, what? Mace said, you've been inside Voss's structure for how long? Price said that question has no bearing on the current situation. Mace said, indulge me. You're good at what you do, better than anyone I've encountered at this particular thing, and I've encountered some capable people. I want to understand how a man holds both sides of that for 11 years without one of them collapsing. A pause that was not hesitation but consideration. The pause of a man deciding that the answer costs him nothing in the current situation. Price said you get very precise about which side is real and which side is performance. Mace said, and the federal work was performance. Price said the federal work was a remarkably useful instrument that I've carried for 11 years. He said it with the satisfaction of a craftsman discussing a tool that has served him well. Mace said 11 years. You were inside before Daniel Sheridan started his case. Price said 3 years before. Mace said, so you watched him build it from the beginning. Price said, every deposition, every evidence filing, every witness interview. I knew what he had before he knew what he had. Kate said quietly, you told Voss about the meeting with Judge Crane. Price looked at her. He said Judge Crane had been a useful asset for 4 years. The problem was that your husband had assembled enough of the financial architecture that her authorization would have created an evidence chain we could not interrupt. It was a practical decision. Kate said you killed her. Price said Voss made that decision. Kate said you arranged for him to be in that room. Price said nothing. Kate said the brake line on Daniel's car. The rest stop went very quiet. The pine trees did not move. Taggart's people were very good at this, at being present without being audible or visible, which was the fundamental skill of men who had spent years in places where the cost of being noticed was final. Price said your husband had a remarkable ability to survive situations designed to end his investigation. 3 separate efforts to discredit his evidence failed. 2 efforts to pressure his witnesses failed. The decision was made to address the source directly. Kate said my children were in that car. Price said that was an accepted consequence of the operational parameters. He said it without flinching, without apology, with the flat efficiency of a man who had organized his interior life in such a way that certain categories of information were stored in a compartment that did not connect to anything resembling a conscience. It was not cruelty. It was something worse than cruelty. It was the complete administrative evacuation of the space where cruelty would have lived. Kate said Amy was learning to ride her bicycle. Ryan had just lost his first tooth. Price said, I know. He said it simply. He had the files. He had always had the files. Kate said, and you did it anyway. Price said yes. In the trees to the north, nothing moved. Nothing at all. Mace said Price. Price said, we're finished talking, Mr. Briggs. Mace said, one more thing. He said it in the tone he had used in the Gulf and in Bosnia and in a dozen other situations where the difference between the next second and the second after it came down to a man's ability to hold very still inside himself. The tone of a man who is not afraid of what is about to happen because he has already decided how he is going to meet it. He said, count the tree line. Price's eyes moved. It was a fast and professional sweep, the eyes of a man who knew exactly what to look for, and what he found in the trees to the north and east was 8 United States Marines who had stopped requiring concealment at the exact moment Mace said the words. Taggart stepped out of the north tree line first, because he had always believed in the clarity of a direct visual, carrying a rifle, with the ease of a man for whom it was an extension of himself, and he was followed by the others, and they arranged themselves in the parking lot in a half circle that left Price the concrete pavilion and his own vehicle, and no other options. Price looked at the half circle. He looked at Mace. He looked at Kate. He said, "You called Marines." Mace said, "Once a Marine, always a Marine. Some of us mean it literally." Price said, "This doesn't end with me." He said it with conviction because it was true, and they all understood it was true. Kate stepped forward. She kept the recovered Glock at her side, and she walked until she was 10 feet from Price. And she stopped, and she looked at him. And when she spoke, it was the voice of a woman who had traveled 18 months through the worst terrain a human being can cross, and had come out the other side carrying everything she went in with. She said Amy was 8 years old, and she had just learned that if you stop being afraid of falling, you can do things you didn't know you could do. Ryan was 6 years old, and he was certain that the tooth fairy left more money for teeth that came out on Tuesdays. We never found out where he got that idea. We never got the chance to find out. She said Daniel spent 3 years of his life trying to prove that the law means what it says it means, that it applies to everyone regardless of what they own or who they own. He believed that. He believed it the way some men believe in things they would die for. She said he did die for it. Her voice did not shake. She said, "You have been running a calculation for 11 years in which people like my husband and children like mine are variables, and the answer always protects Raymond Voss. You have been very good at that calculation." She said, "I am here to tell you that the calculation ended this morning. The equation changed, and you are what remains on the wrong side of it." Price's weapon had drifted by a single degree, the way a weapon drifts when the man holding it is listening, in spite of everything that should prevent him from listening. It was the only degree that mattered. Kate raised her weapon, and Price, who had spent 11 years being the most capable person in every room, made the decision that men of his type always make when the structure of their control collapses, which is to attempt to restore it by force. And he swung the Glock back toward Kate, and Mace was already moving. I had crossed 8 feet of concrete before Price completed the swing. The combat knife was in his hand because he had placed it there 30 seconds ago. While Price was explaining himself and Mace was positioning, and the blade caught Price's gun hand at the wrist, with the precision of 35 years of training compressed into one movement, and the Glock discharged into the concrete and skipped away, and Price went down with Mace on top of him. It was brief and not complicated, and at the end of it, Price was face down with his wrist behind him, and Taggart was standing over him with zip ties and the satisfied expression of a man who has seen this resolution before and finds it appropriate. Price's two support personnel came out of their vehicles with their hands visible because they had watched 8 Marines materialize from the tree line and had performed the arithmetic correctly and quickly. May stood. He looked at Kate. She had the weapon at her side. Her breathing was controlled. Her face was the face of a woman who has seen what she came to see and is still on her feet, which is the thing that matters. He said, "You okay?" She said, "I will be." He said, "That's the right answer." She looked at Price on the ground. She said, "He talks to real federal prosecutors." Taggart said from where he stood over Price, "I have a contact in the Washington field. 22-year relationship. I'll make the call." Mace said Washington, not Denver. Taggart said Washington then. He pulled out his phone with the expression of a man for whom this was not the most complicated situation he had ever been asked to resolve. Price said from the concrete, "Concrete, you don't understand what you're dismantling. Voss has protections you haven't mapped, at levels you haven't reached." Mace crouched beside him. He said, "Price, I have been a Marine and then an outlaw and then a man who lived alone on a mountain. In all 3 of those lives, I never once operated at a level where I didn't expect the thing I was doing to be harder than I expected. You are not telling me anything new." Price said Voss will come himself. When he finds out how comprehensively this has failed, he will come himself. Mace said, "Good." He said it simply, the way a man says the word good about rain when the ground is dry. Price looked at him. Mace said, "It saves us the trouble of finding him." The message went out from Price's phone at 10:15 in the morning, composed by Kate with the economical precision of a woman who understood how men like Price communicated with men like Voss. Package confirmed compromised. Evidence not destroyed. Source must be handled personally. Copper Falls. Tonight. The response came in 9 minutes. Understood. Tonight. They had 12 hours. They spent them with the discipline of people who understood that preparation was the variable that determined outcomes. Taggart's 8 men moved through Copper Falls with the systematic efficiency of 2 decades of professional practice, establishing fields of fire positioning, the explosive charges that Mace had prepared in the locations that would channel rather than simply destroy, marking fallback routes and secondary positions with the care of men for whom these details were not precautions, but necessities. Kate worked alongside them from the beginning, without being asked and without requiring instruction on anything she had been trained for, and on the things she had not been trained for. She watched and adapted with a speed that made Taggart look at Mace at one point and raise an eyebrow. Mace said FBI Academy. 18 weeks. Taggart said, "Why'd she stop?" Mace said, "Preferred the courtroom." Taggart said, "Shame. She'd have been exceptional." By 8 o'clock, the town was set, and the people in it were in position, and the waiting began, which was always the hardest part, because waiting was where the mind went to work on the things that couldn't be controlled or prepared for. Mace sat on the stone step of the assay office in the cold dark and thought about what Price had said. Voss will come himself. He thought about what kind of man made that decision. Not a man acting rationally in a deteriorating situation, because a rational man in a deteriorating situation finds a way out. A man who comes himself when his operation has collapsed is a man who has confused himself with his own power for so long that he cannot imagine a world in which his physical presence is not the determining factor. That was a specific kind of dangerous, and it was also, Mace knew from experience, a specific kind of vulnerable. Kate came and sat on the step beside him. They were quiet for a while. She said, "Are you afraid?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That surprises me." He said, "It shouldn't. Fear is information. A man who isn't afraid before a fight is either lying to you or hasn't understood the situation." She said, "Daniel used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision that something else mattered more." Mace said Daniel was right about a great deal. She said, "I was wrong about some things too. He worked too much. He forgot that the people who gave the work its meaning were not a secondary consideration, but the primary one. He was better at the case than he was at the Saturday afternoon. I told him that. I wish I had told him more often." She said it plainly and without self-pity, setting something down outside herself. Mace said, "You told him some." She said, "Yes, some." He said, "Some counts more than people give it credit for." She turned to look at him. In the mountain dark, her face was clear and still. She said, "After this, when it's finished, don't disappear back into a mountain somewhere." He said, "I wasn't planning to." She said, "I'm telling you not to. There is a difference between not planning a thing and being told not to do it, and I want to be precise." He looked at her. He said, "Kate." She said, "What?" He said, "I'm not going anywhere." She held his gaze for a moment with the attention she brought to everything that mattered, the look of a woman measuring the character of a person against the weight of what they're saying. Then she nodded once, the nod of a woman who has decided. She said, "Good." She went back inside to authenticate the dead man's switch, and he sat alone on the stone step with the cold coming off the mountain and the October stars overhead and the dog tags warm against his chest. He heard the vehicles at 10:22, not 4 this time. Voss had learned from Copper Falls and had adjusted his arithmetic. 6 SUVs moving up the single road with purpose and coordination, and behind them, separate from the formation, a dark sedan that moved with the particular deliberateness of a man who expected the road to be managed before he arrived. Taggart's voice in his ear very quiet. 6 vehicles, minimum 14 personnel, separate command vehicle hanging back, That him. Mace said, that's him. Taggart said, we hold until he's out of the vehicle. Mace said, confirmed. He went inside. Kate was at the window. She had the Glock and her face was set in the particular configuration of a person who has arrived at the moment that everything before it was preparation for, and who finds discovering it that they are after already. He stood beside her and they watched through the dusty glass as the SUVs rolled into the main street of Copper Falls, and the doors opened, and the men came out with the coordinated precision of people who had been told this would be manageable, that the opposition was two people in a stone building, that the weight of numbers and training was decisively on their side. Voss's sedan stopped at the far end of the main street. The door did not open immediately. Making them wait, Kate said very quietly. He said, it's what he does. It's how he's organized his entire life. When Voss's voice came, it was amplified by a small speaker, and it carried the cultured certainty of a man who had been the largest presence in every room he had entered for 40 years, and had never had reason to revise that assessment. He said, Ms. Sheridan, I know you're here. I have known where you were for 3 days. Let us be honest with each other finally. You have something that belongs to my operation. I want it returned. And I want to meet the woman who has caused me more genuine difficulty than anyone since your late husband. He said late husband with a specific softness, the softness of a man who believes that naming a wound is a form of control over it. Kate said next to Mace very quietly, he thinks that still hurts me. Mace said, does it? She said it did, for a long time. Now it just tells me that he has not understood what he is actually dealing with. Voss said, come out and we will discuss terms. You have my word. Mace opened the door of the assay office and walked into the street. The 14 men in the street adjusted in his peripheral vision, some holding position, some shifting angle, all of them doing the mathematics on a single man walking toward their employer in the darkness of a ghost town. Voss's sedan door opened. I was smaller than Mace had expected, given the dimensions of the damage he had caused. Not physically small, but without the mass that men who routinely deployed large amounts of violence often accumulated, as though they absorbed some of it into their bodies. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that had been made for him by someone who understood what suited him, and he walked with the ease of a man who had never in his adult life been uncertain of his position relative to the people around him. His eyes were the color of old concrete and had about the same warmth. He looked at Mace and said, you must be the motorcycle man. Mace said former. Voss said yes. I heard about the patch. He said it with the specific satisfaction of someone who tracks collateral damage as a form of professional assessment. That must have been painful. 30 years of belonging reduced to a vote. Mace said it clarified a great many things. Voss said it should have clarified that you were protecting something that was never yours to protect, and that the woman represents a problem that is substantially beyond your capacity to solve. He said it without contempt, as a genuine puzzlement, the puzzlement of a man who had structured his entire understanding of human behavior around the concept of capacity and found himself genuinely uncertain how to account for someone who seemed to be operating outside that framework. Mace said, you murdered a federal judge in her own chambers. Voss said, I resolved a significant liability. Mace said, you murdered a woman who had spent 30 years serving the institution of American law. Voss said, the institution of American law is a useful fiction, Mr. Briggs. It serves those with sufficient resources to shape it. This has always been the case, and it will remain the case long after you and I are both finished. He said it without anger, as a statement about the nature of things that he considered settled. Mace said, you murdered 2 children. Something moved across Voss's face. Not guilt or not guilt as most people understood it, but something that was briefly adjacent to it. The involuntary acknowledgement of a man who has maintained a very precise internal accounting and has registered that one particular entry sits near a line he prefers not to think about too directly. He said that was regrettable. Mace said regrettable. Voss said it was a decision made under specific operational pressure. I take no satisfaction in it. Kate came out of the assay office. She walked into the street, and she did not hurry and she did not hesitate. and the men around Voss tracked her with their weapons, and she walked as though the weapons were not information that changed anything about her trajectory or her purpose. She walked until she was 15 feet from Voss, and she stopped. She said Raymond Voss. He looked at her with the interest of a man examining something that has proven considerably more durable than he designed for. He said, Ms. Sheridan, you look better than I expected given the circumstances. She said Amy was 80 years old. Ryan was 6. My husband spent 3 years documenting every structure you built, every official you purchased, every dollar you moved through schools and hospitals and roads, while the children in those schools went without, and the patients in those hospitals waited in hallways. He did it because he believed the law meant exactly what it said, not as an aspiration, as a fact. Voss said your husband was a remarkable man. I say that with genuine respect. He came closer than any investigator before him. She said he did, and I finished it. She said everything that Price knew we have documented. Every wire transfer, every recorded conversation, every official at every level who has been operating under your influence. The FBI Washington field office has it. The Senate Judiciary Committee has it. 15 news organizations have it. It transmitted automatically this morning when Price failed to provide the authentication code at the scheduled time. She let that settle in the cold air of the ghost town street. She said, you did not come here for the camera. The camera was never the only copy, and you knew that before you arrived. You came here because men like you cannot accept that the thing they have spent 40 years building is gone. You need to see the person who took it. You need to understand how it happened. Voss looked at her for a long time. Something moved in the concrete-colored eyes, something that was not exactly recognition, but was adjacent to it. The look of a man who is being told a true thing by someone who has earned the right to tell it. He said, I came here to end this cleanly. He made a small gesture with his right hand. Taggart's voice in Mace's ear said, engaging now. The north tree line opened first 4 positions simultaneously. The disciplined, controlled fire of men who understood that the first 3 seconds of a firefight determine the shape of everything that follows. From the east, Reyes and Drummond addressed the 2 men nearest the command sedan before they had completed the calculation of what was happening. The explosive charges at the south end of the main street detonated at Taggart's signal, bringing the front of the old general store down in a cascade of gray timber and a concussive pressure wave that rolled through the street and reorganized the geography of the engagement. Voss's men were professional, and they responded with the speed of training, and it was not enough because the difference between men who are capable in violent situations and Marines who have been doing this in conditions designed to kill them for 20 years is not a difference of degree, but of kind, and the kind does not favor the former. From the south end of the street, in the moment when Voss's formation was engaged from the north and east, headlights cut through the gun smoke and the dust of the demolished building, and 3 motorcycles came up the main street and stopped at the south perimeter of the engagement zone. And Hawk came off the lead bike with 3 men behind him and took a position at the south end of the street that sealed the last open avenue of retreat. I was not wearing his Hell's Angels cut. None of them were. They were not there as the club. They were there as men who had calculated in the 12 hours since the vote what the vote had actually cost them and had decided to pay what it cost to correct it. Hawk looked north through the chaos and found Mace in the street and raised one hand. Mace saw it and understood it, and there was no more between them than that because there did not need to be. The fight was loud and close and happened in the dark between the gray buildings of the dead town, and when the main exchange was finished, 8 of Voss's men were down, and 4 were attempting to reach vehicles that Taggart's people had disabled in the first 30 seconds, and 2 had put their weapons down and were making no further decisions about the night. Voss was backed against the stone wall of the assay office with his weapon leveled, and Mace 6 feet in front of him, and Kate 3 feet to Mace's left, and all 3 of them perfectly still in the settling dust and the smell of cordite and timber smoke. Mace had blood on his left arm, where a round had creased him, and his right leg was wrong in a way that was going to require attention, and none of it was relevant to the next 60 seconds. Voss looked at the street. at the remains of the operation he had sent into it, at the tree line where Taggart's people were no longer requiring concealment, at the south end of the street where Hawk stood. He said, I have resources you haven't reached, people in positions you don't know exist. Kate said, I know. He said, this doesn't conclude with me. What I've built is larger than one man. She said, I know that too. She stepped forward. She said, Raymond Voss, my husband believed the law was worth dying for. I believed he was worth finishing for. And my children. Her voice carried in the cold air of the ghost town with the clarity of something that has been stripped down to its essential truth. She said, my children were worth all of it. She said, you are going to be arrested. You are going to stand in a federal courtroom in front of a judge who has not been reached by your money, and the evidence that Daniel spent 3 years building and that I spent 18 months completing is going to be presented by prosecutors who have not been purchased, and you are going to answer for every single decision you have made. She said, that is not optimism. That is the situation as it currently exists. You can see it clearly, or you can maintain the story you have been telling yourself, but the story does not change the situation. Voss looked at her for a long time. Something moved in the concrete-colored eyes. Something that was not guilt, because guilt required the kind of interior connection that had been systematically removed from this man's architecture over 40 years of successful operation. But something that was in its way a form of recognition. The recognition of a man who has been told a true thing by someone who has paid enough to earn the right to say it. He lowered the weapon, not dropped, lowered, because men like Voss, even at the final point, do not abandon the last form of control available to them, which is the manner of the surrender itself. Taggart was beside him before the weapon reached waist level, a large and very calm hand closing over Voss's gun hand with the practiced ease of a man who has done this before, and then it was over. Mace stood in the middle of the main street of Copper Falls and breathed. Kate came and stood beside him. She was unhurt. She was standing straight. She looked at Voss being walked toward Taggart's vehicle, and she said nothing for a long time. The dust was settling. The smoke from the demolished building was thinning. The stars overhead were the particular October stars of high altitude, each one precise and very far away. Then she said quietly to the cold mountain air for Amy and Ryan. She said it with the finality of something set down at the end of a road that had been very long and had required everything she had and had asked for more than that, and she had found it, and now the road was finished, and what remained was the question of what came after it. She put her hand in his. He closed his fingers around it. From the south end of the street came the sound of vehicles that were not Taggart's and not Hawk's, and the sweep of headlights, and Mace's hand tightened on the knife before he heard Taggart in the earpiece. Government plates. Washington. That's your FBI. Agent Margot Fenn was a small woman with gray-streaked hair, cut practically short, and the kind of tired eyes that came from spending a career seeing what people did to each other when they believed no one with authority was paying attention. She got out of the lead vehicle and walked across the main street of Copper Falls in shoes that were going to be ruined by the gravel and dust, and she shook Kate's hand first and then Mace's. She said, Mrs. Sheridan, everything you transmitted reached us intact. Every file, every recording, every document. We have been working from it for 14 hours. Kate said the Denver field office. Fenn said is being managed by my people. We identified 3 individuals operating under Voss's influence within that office. They are in custody as of this morning. Kate said the senator. Fenn said Senator Greer reached out voluntarily when he received the transmissions. His cooperation has been extensive and continues to be. He was, as you assessed, genuinely clean. Kate said, and Thomas Voss. Fenn looked at her with the attention of a woman reassessing her model of how much the person in front of her knows. She said, you know about Thomas? Kate said Daniel had a note in his personal journal. A contact who had reached out through an anonymous back channel. Someone inside the organization. Daniel never confirmed who it was. He didn't live long enough. She reached into her jacket and took out a folded page, a single sheet from Daniel's handwritten notes, the handwriting precise and small, the notation of a man who had learned to document everything. She unfolded it and read it aloud. She said, anonymous source, inside the organization, won't identify himself. Provided internal financial documentation account, structures wire routing, wants nothing, no immunity, no protection. Just said I want out of this name. She folded the page and held it. She said Daniel underlined that last sentence twice. He thought it was the most important thing the source had said. He just never found out who. Fenn said Thomas Voss, 34 years old, physician in Philadelphia. He contacted us 8 months ago through a lawyer in Boston who had no connection to any of this. He provided the complete internal financial architecture of the money laundering network. Account structures, wire routing the names of every official on the payroll at every level. He asked for nothing in return. He said he wanted his name to mean something different than it currently meant. Kate said nothing. Mace thought about a 34-year-old man in Philadelphia making the decision that the name he had been given by his father was not the name he was going to keep, that the inheritance accumulated over 40 years of systematic corruption and violence was not something he was willing to carry into the rest of his life, that there was a way out of the name and he was going to take it regardless of what it cost him to do so. I thought it was one of the braver decisions he had heard of. Not the adrenaline kind of brave, not the kind that had a physical component and happened in seconds. The interior kind, the kind that had to be made and remade every day for 8 months while you waited to see whether the decision would hold. Fenn said he's been in a secure location since yesterday morning. He's safe. Taggart appeared at Mace's shoulder with the expression of a man who has successfully managed a complicated situation and is now prepared to address the administrative aftermath. He said, you need a medic, Briggs. Your arm has been bleeding for 20 minutes and your leg is not behaving correctly. Mace said in a moment. Taggart said now. He said it in the tone that he had used in the Gulf when Mace had made identical arguments about identical situations with identical evidence. And Mace had learned 30 years ago that Taggart in that particular tone was not conducting a negotiation. He said, fine. Kate said to Taggart, thank you for coming, for all of it. Taggart said, ma'am, I have known Mace Briggs since he was 21 years old and too stubborn to know when to let someone help him. He has never in all that time done a single thing I thought was wrong. Whatever he decided needed doing here was sufficient reason for me to be here doing it. He said it without any of the qualities that would have made it smaller. Then he said, the medic is at the east end of the street, and walked toward the east end of the street. Hawk came from the south entrance as Mace was starting toward the medic, and Mace stopped. Hawk was not wearing the cut. None of his 3 men were. They had left that at home and come in the clothes they stood in without the organization's flag as men rather than as members, which was Mace thought its own kind of statement about what membership actually meant when it was real. Hawk said, we heard it was tonight. Mace said, you're not here as the club. Hawk said no. He said it without qualification. We're here as men who had a chance to stand when it mattered and took the wrong option the first time. He paused. Some decisions deserve a second attempt. He looked at the street, at Voss in custody, at Fenn's team moving through the ghost town with their lights and their evidence collection, at the gray buildings standing in the starlight, the way they had stood for 130 years preceding all of this, and likely outlasting most of what would come after it. He reached inside his jacket and took out a folded piece of leather and held it toward Mace. The patch, Death's Head and Colorado bottom rocker worn smooth by 30 years of wind and weather, and the accumulated weight of a life lived in a particular direction. Mace took it and held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. At the faded embroidery and the creased leather and the particular history that was sewn into it. All the miles, all the years, all the men. The things the organization had asked of him that had been worth giving, and the things that had been less clear, and the moments more of them than he could count, when riding with brothers through the open country of the American West, had felt like the most honest version of freedom he had access to. He folded it carefully. He held it back toward Hawk. He said, I'm not that man anymore. Hawk said, I know, Mace said, but he was a good man. Mostly. And I'm glad I was him for a while. Hawk took the patch back. He held it for a moment with the particular attention of a man receiving something that costs something to give. He said, what you did here tonight, coming back for this when you had every reason not to. Mace said I had every reason to. Hawk said, I know, that's what I mean. He put the patch back in his jacket. He said, if you need anything, ever, you know where we are. Mace said, I do. Thank you for coming. Hawk looked at Kate, who was standing at a respectful distance, giving them the space the conversation required. He said to her, you did something here tonight, ma'am. Something that matters and will keep mattering. Kate said, we did something. Hawk looked between them with the eyes of a man who has spent 35 years reading the space between people and knows what he is looking at. He said, take care of each other. He walked back toward the south end of the street with his three men, and they were gone into the dark as quietly as they had arrived. The sound of the motorcycles fading down the mountain road, and then the silence of Copper Falls reasserting itself, which was the silence it had been practicing for 130 years. The medic was quick and efficient, and the arm was a graze that needed cleaning and closing, and the leg was a deep bruise from a piece of flying timber, in structural rather than circulatory. And Mace sat on the tailgate of Fenn's vehicle and let the work be done while Kate stood beside him and watched it happen. She said, you're going to be all right. He said, I know. She said, I need you to be. He said, I know that too. The medic finished and stepped away, and they were alone in the way. Two people can be alone in the middle of considerable activity in the gravity of their own specific situation. He said, witness protection, new identities, what Fenn offered. She said, I heard her. He said, is that what you want? She looked at the mountains visible now, the way mountains are only visible at night, as the solid absence of stars, the darkness of peaks against the dark of sky, permanent in particular. She said, I want to finish what Daniel started. Not only this case, the work. There are 37 compromised officials in those files, and every investigation they corrupted, and every verdict they bent, and every person who was harmed by what Voss built inside the system. That has to be taken apart piece by prosecutors who are not afraid of it. I want to be one of those prosecutors. In a courtroom. With my name. He said, that's a long road. She said, I know. She looked at him. Is that something you can be part of? He said, I have spent the last 30 years understanding how criminal organizations operate from the inside. That's a skill set with applications to the security dimension of what you're describing. She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved. She said, you could have simply said yes. He said yes. She took his hand. 14 months ago, Mace Briggs had gone to a cabin in the mountains to be alone, to exist in the specific silence of a man who had decided that the world's requirements were no longer something he was interested in engaging with. To be in the most reduced sense only himself in a place where that was sufficient and nothing more was asked. I thought about that man in the chair by the fire with the dog tags, and the empty whiskey glass and the cross his grandfather had carved, waiting out whatever remained of a life he had concluded was mostly finished. He did not regret that man. He recognized him. He was simply no longer him. The road from that chair to this tailgate had run through fire and loss, and the specific clarity that comes when everything you believe was permanent turns out not to be, and what you find underneath it once it has burned away is what was always actually there. He thought his grandfather, who had believed in the long view and in the kind of accountability that did not require an audience, would have called this an acceptable outcome. I thought Daniel Sheridan, who had believed the law was worth dying for, would have found in this night something worth the cost, though the cost had been impossibly high and no verdict could make it otherwise. I thought about Amy learning to balance on a bicycle and Ryan checking the gap in his teeth with his tongue in the particular faith of children that the world is fundamentally safe, a faith that everyone large enough to protect it owes something to. And he thought that what had happened here tonight in this abandoned town in the cold mountain dark was part of the payment. I thought about Kate beside him and about what came after the road she had been running since she stayed home with the flu on a Friday morning 18 months ago. He thought he would like to be part of finding that out. That was new. That was not something he had thought about another person in a long time. It felt given everything available to feel like the right direction. 14 months later, in the late afternoon of an August day, Mace sat on the front porch of the house they had bought in a quiet neighborhood on the western edge of Denver, working on the rocking chair he was building from scratch with the techniques his grandfather had taught him, the hand tools laid out on the porch railing in their order of use. The pine was local from a mill north of the city, and it smelled of resin and cut wood in the August heat. Each piece he had fitted by hand without power tools. The joints made the old way, because some things were worth doing slowly and by hand, if you had the time and the knowledge, and he had both. Kate came through the screen door and sat in the chair beside his, the one he had built first 3 months ago, before the porch furniture section of the project had expanded to include the rocker. She had a glass of iced tea in each hand, and she set one on the railing beside his tools. She was 5 months along. They had not planned it precisely, but they had not planned it, which was its own kind of decision. She said Fenn called. He set down the hand plane. He said, and she said the Voss sentencing was this morning. Federal judge, no affiliation to any of the 37 names in Daniel's files. 42 years for Voss. Price accepted the plea to avoid trial. 31 years. He cooperated fully in the end, which was the choice he should have made considerably earlier. She said the 37th name on Daniel's list was sentenced yesterday. That's all of them. She said this plainly as a report on the completion of something which was what it was. He picked up the glass of iced tea and looked at the mountains in the distance, the Rockies catching the late afternoon light in the particular way they caught it in August. The peaks still snow-capped above the tree line, the lower slopes green in particular, the way mountains look when they have been standing long enough to be entirely themselves. She said Thomas Voss testified at 2 of the trials. He was in the courtroom the day his father was sentenced. Mace said, how was he? She said, Fenn said he looked like a man who had put something down that he had been carrying for a long time. She paused. She said he looked specifically like that. They were quiet for a while with the August light on the porch and the sound of the neighborhood around them, which was the sound of other people's ordinary lives continuing in the way they continued. Kate put her hand on her belly. The baby moved. She said, she's been active all afternoon. He said she knows it's a good day. Kate said, how do you know it's a she? He said, I don't. But she feels like a she. Kate looked at him. She said, what do you want for her? He thought about that with the seriousness it deserved. He said everything she decides she wants, whatever form that takes, and the understanding of what's worth fighting for when the time comes, because the time does come. It always comes. Kate said, and the judgment to know when she's found the person worth going through it with. He said that too. She took his hand, and he held it, and the August light moved across the porch in the slow way it moves on long summer afternoons. And in the distance the mountains stood, where they had always stood, indifferent and immense and permanent. And on his chest the dog tags were warm from the sun, and beside them on a short chain, the new thing he wore, a simple band of gold that matched the one Kate wore, each of them plain and worn smooth already from contact with the ordinary days. He picked up the hand plane. He went back to work. The rocking chair was almost finished. Another afternoon, maybe 2. Then it would be ready for the porch, and the porch would be complete, and they would sit on it in the evenings when the heat had broken, and the mountains turned purple in the western light, and whatever came next would come, and they would meet it. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was the thing he had not been able to name in the cabin on the mountain, in the chair by the fire with the empty glass and the dog tags and the 14 months of careful solitude. The thing that had been missing from the accounting. A reason not just to endure what came, a reason to be here for it.